on biopharma research digitalization. As I said, my name is Nick Lynch, and I work for a company called Curlew Research. It gives me great pleasure to be hosting this event that Zifo Technologies is helping us run. And equally, I will in a minute introduce our three expert panelists. What I would like to do first is say that we are recording this webinar and it should be available after the event. We're allowing you to pose questions using the Q&A part of Zoom. So feel free to post those as you go. And we'll find time both at the end of the first session and then at the end to take your questions and look equally to perhaps questions on future events and future topics. So let me get started with introducing our three panelists and equally what topics we would like to cover today. So digitalization and data has been with us within R&D for decades, but really I think this last few years, and obviously with the challenges of COVID and the advancements in some of the science techniques, particularly AI, the value of that data is becoming ever more important. Hence, ever more efforts are being put into the digitalization workflow from the beginning of the life cycle of data at experiment level, all the way through to the point when data is initially analyzed and all the secondary analysis. And with our three panelists, we hope to bring you some real examples, not just from the ELN LIMS world, but covering the breadth of their experience. So with no further ado, I'm going to just briefly introduce our panelists and then let them say a bit more detail about themselves, and then we'll head into the sort of the webinar topics for real. So firstly, we have AJ Shah, who is at BMS and is the lead for translational IT, as well as has positions in academia and has balanced that over the years since he joined BMS. We have Robin Brewer, who has been at AstraZeneca for over 15 years now, and has been leading efforts in lab digitalization and is based in Gothenburg, Sweden. And then we have Thomas Kern, who is working at Roche and leads up the AI ML part involved in lab automation. So thank you all three of you for beginning to being part of this webinar. And I'll just hand over to AJ to give a brief intro on himself.
Hey, thank you, Nick, and thank you to all my fellow panelists for being part of this panel, and thank you to Zifo for organizing this. And again, everyone for spending an hour here on in joining us for the panel. So a little bit about myself. I have been at BMS for about 3.5 years. My current role is as a head IT BP, business partner for cell therapy research and early development, all of early research and development for BMS, and all of the clinical pharmacology and pharmacometrics. My previous role at BMS was heading up the IT business partnering function for translational medicine. And prior to that, I worked at City of Hope, National Medical Center, and Beckman Research Institute, at Elan Pharmaceuticals and Pfizer, among other places. I very much look forward to talking about some of the work that we have done over the last 3 years since I joined BMS in the areas of building a data platform that brings the clinical, real world, and discovery data together. And I'll also talk a little bit about some of the efforts that we spent on programs that are related to bringing uniformity in collection, integration, and analysis of laboratory-based data. So I'm looking forward to the panel, and thank you, Nick, once again.
Thanks, AJ. And Robin, please.
Hi, everybody. Robin Brouwer. Really nice to be here and sharing some real learnings from our Digital Lab program that has been running for a couple of years now. So Digital Lab, I'm leading the IT Digital Lab program, and it's built really around 3 pillars. One is around our services and solution capability. We're moving to platform teams, and how do we set that up as a new capability? So that's one pillar. The next pillar is looking at the foundations in the lab. So I'll give some examples of what we're doing in the foundations pillar. And then thirdly, there's a transformation element to our program as well, looking at the workflows in the labs. How can we augment those workflows, looking at the data and verification of the data. So again, thanks for the invitation and looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thanks, Robin. And Thomas.
Thanks, Nick. So yes, a bit about me. So basically, I'm a physicist. I did my PhD in physics before I went into structural biology. I was working on antibiotic resistance and generally using NMR to study large molecules. Went then into the automation space about 10 years ago now. So I've been working for close to 7 years for a big automation company before joining Roche 2.5 years ago, where I'm now part of the discovery informatics team. And we have a quite big digital transformation ongoing in the moment, where we mainly look at how can we leverage our data and data automation space to actually support scientists and decisions in their discovery projects.
Great,
and
Thomas.
I'm really happy being here and sharing our experience. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So as you can see, we've got a great range of from our panelists today, and certainly, as we said, we're going to cover a couple of topics. First of all, we'll kick off with the augmenting the scientists' efforts, and as perhaps as Thomas and Robin alluded to, this is really looking at some of that early life cycle that can really impact the lab scientist, not just in the lab, but in the way that they analyze and share their data early stage. And then once we've covered that topic, we'll take questions, as we said, and then we're going to move on to the broader topic of data and the decision support and supporting decision making. And we realized that, you know, of all the topics in 2020, FAIR has really caught on, and there's many efforts that are looking at FAIR, but we really want to take it beyond that and look at, you know, some of the learnings from what FAIR means, the adoption strategies, and the change process for making FAIR data valuable, both in the short term and the long term. So as I said, please ask questions as you think of them, and we'll take them in a couple of sessions during the next 50 minutes. So just coming back, I heard a couple of points from Robin and Thomas about the work that they've been doing around the augmenting the scientist and making the lab a great place to work. Robin, did you want to perhaps describe some of the efforts that you sort of covered initially within the AstraZeneca space and some of the benefits that you've already seen with what you've done? Yeah, absolutely. So if I start with what I mentioned in the 3 pillars, so one is around a service and solution platform team. So for me, it starts there, right? We need to have our people physically in the labs, collaborating with our scientists to understand what are some of the the here and now pain points. What are some of smaller enhancements that we can make to to workflows, to applications. So for me, the journey of digitalization starts there. You need to showcase in a small scale, what value can we bring. So that's one example where we've now got a new team, an in-source team that is out and about in the labs, finding new opportunities to automate. Another example is in the foundations layer. When you look at least in our estate, when we looked at the labs and how the scientists actually work, we didn't have a good solution for bringing your office into the lab and from the lab back out to the office. So literally, bringing your enterprise device, your laptop into the lab, potentially in labs that have contamination risks. How do we enable that? So we've actually deployed laptops that can turn into tablets with a protective sleeve where necessary. The right
arms in the lab so that you can hook your tablet up. So really from a great place to work environment, enable the scientists to move from the write-up areas into the lab and back, and that's again where digitization starts. We need to enable this for our scientists. So that's one example. Another example is specifically around using voice technology. This is by no means rolled out to every single lab in AstraZeneca, but we do have use cases where it's, your hands might be tied up, they might be gloved up. How can we augment that with voice capabilities to transcribe whatever is said directly into some notes? Now we're taking small steps, and again, I'll reiterate this a couple of times. We need to start small, show the value, and then scale fast. So with regards to voice, we have some way to go, absolutely, but it's showing value in particularly if you're operating on an animal, for instance, your hands are tied. Can we take those notes via voice, and then at a later stage copy paste them, so to speak, into the relevant systems, be it ELNs or LIMS. So there is some way to go to make that even more automated, but it's a great example where we see some great benefits already. Hope that gives you some examples. I can go on for a couple of more minutes, but.
Just coming into that sort of what was the reaction of the scientist group in terms of some of the changes that you've mentioned?
It's a great question. I think it's a mixed bag, to be honest. So when you have an approach where you start small, you will always have some people who are sort of wary of the change. But I think once you've showcased that value, if I refer back to, for instance, bringing in tablets into the labs, that is a change journey in itself. We've run ideation events with our scientists. We have digital champions, we call them, in the scientific domains. So around 100 people globally who we use as, you could say, sounding boards, but that also helps with that journey that you're taking that whole group on. So I think that's been instrumental for us to, not that this is not perceived as an IT push, so to speak. So to have those change agents with you is critical.
Great, thanks. Thomas, I know, just building on what you'd mentioned about the work in Roche, how would you sort of summarize some of those activities against the augmented scientist?
Yeah, so currently basically what we are looking at is, so we see the drug discovery workflow basically also going similar to Robin with the 3 pillars. So basically we see there are 4 pillars. Basically you have this design activities, make activities, test activities, and analyze activities in your drug discovery project teams. And what we're currently working towards is basically providing our end-to-end workflows and activities. So that basically means we're capturing information, various type of activities along the value chain, and we actually want to leverage information that is, for example, captured in the compound design phase, where basically the chemist has a design hypothesis later on in testing to basically focus the work of the assay owners that they do the right test on the compounds to invalidate or validate, example, the hypothesis that the chemist had when he was designing the compound. And another example, basically then, based off historic data on the compound, we also want to come up with like recommendations based on that data on what would be like the suitable compounds to progress into the next years in their, let's say, project activity cascades, where they test their compounds in the different phases. So we also want, when on the other hand, use the operational data we're capturing to also then support the assay owner in providing them enhanced planning and scheduling capabilities in the labs. So it basically means leveraging capacity, demand, throughput, and the resources available to basically help them organize their work in the lab. And that's becoming more and more important. Like example, you see the period center behind me, where we'll have more and more shared labs in the future. So, and in this shared environment, it becomes more crucial also to have like advanced planning and scheduling capabilities. But I mean, overall, this is just like examples of how we want to aggregate data to basically use them in supporting scientists in making the decision. Doesn't matter if the scientist is like more working in the office, making concepts and designing compounds, or is an SA owner that has to run a lab and has to run all the tests of the compounds that are coming in. So that mainly means that we are currently highly focusing on system integration, because a lot of the data sits now, I mean, silos with overuse, but in different systems that are not all basically capable of talking to each other. So that's basically one of the main challenges we have to solve now. Is how we basically get the data, capture the right context of the data, and we should map the data to make it basically actionable then in our workflow steps. And so one of the big challenges we're having is actually that we are dealing with a mix of, let's say, mature systems. They might have legacy issues compared to other partners that may have like newer innovative solutions. They are not quite yet at the mature level we need them, and basically bring that together in a common architecture that basically supports those type of workflows. And we basically have a very high number of various combinations of different products, technologies, and proprietary solutions in our landscape. And I think that's a current challenge to us, basically how we deal with that. And I mean, we have already a success story where we developed an in-house solution called Autolab. You might have heard about that, based on Camunda technology, where we now basically have an orchestration platform that allows us to basically integrate our different systems of data coming from different systems and having them in an external workflow layer, and allowing us to pushing example information to instruments, putting information instruments, pushing it to our data warehouses and data systems, having data links on it, and so on. So basically, and also what Robin says, actually we want to use those systems then to empower our scientists in the labs, also to make those platforms their own and be able to model their own workflows, set up their own workflows based on our platforms and technologies, and get them more and more basically working together cross-area, cross-functional, by sharing the same platforms and technologies and data.
If I might add something to that, Nick.
Sure.
What Thomas mentioned, I think, is around shared capabilities. I think is a great opportunity in the sense that, you know, one of the challenges in the lab has always been is there's such a diverse set of, you know, scientists and instruments, and you know, one challenge when you start to talk about platforms and commonalities and similar workflows is, well, how do you build that? And as a catalyzer, you can actually use that shared you know, let's call them centers of excellence concept to actually drive those commonalities. That's at least from my experience, where it's suddenly becoming apparent. I mean, I need to move away from me and my instruments to a shared service that I tap into. Well, in order to do that, we need to agree the workflows. We need to agree how we're going to store the data. We need to agree how we're going to analyze the data. So in those sites globally where we have those incentives, I guess, for shared instrumentation, is actually where we get a lot of momentum behind digitization and standardization. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. I think there's actually a big change component to what we do in digitalization, because I think like we have a lot of experts in the IT space and experts in the science space, but I think they have more and more basically to work together and have a really common understanding of their processes and the technology is also involved there to make basically the entire workflow their own, and don't have basically someone doing its expertise or with its expertise and don't communicate with other. It's really important basically to share the technologies and platforms.
So about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago now, we started looking at all the labs in the translational medicine space, and there were about a dozen labs in translational medicine space, which ranged from genetics and genomics to flow cytometry to translational research, a pathology lab, immunohistochemistry labs, and all of that. So what we did was we created a really simple grid. We put all the labs as columns and said, okay, here's genetics and genomics labs, here's a flow cytometry lab, here's a pathology lab, or IHC lab, or biomarker lab. And on the as the rows, we put all the activities, and we said, okay, what are the main activities that happen in the lab? So for example, every lab has planning and workflow. Every lab has sample tracking. Every lab has laboratory information management, or every lab has a need for recording their experiments in form of ELN. They all do some amount of outsourcing, or they all do certain amount of raw data management, or they all do certain amount of analysis or results management. So when we created this grid, we started putting all the systems that each of these labs use for that, and it was really eye-opening, because all the labs, because of historic reasons, and really nothing wrong with that, right? And through through acquisitions, or through evolution from a very small lab to a major functions, they all had systems and way of capturing data, a way of managing data, way of analyzing the data. It was all over the place. It ranged from using email to using S3 buckets to using a proper LIMS system. So we took all of that and we said, okay, now if we were to make a common across the row common solution, a digitization across the row, for example, for planning and workflow, if you wanted to come up with a common solution, digital solution, what would it look like? Or if you want to track the samples, biospecimen, or a biosample, if you want to, or biologics, you want to track it you want to track that. What would be the uniform way of tracking that across the labs? Or what would be the uniform way of managing large files that come out of various instruments? So we started looking at this row-wise digitization, and the suite of applications that we call under a program we called collabs, that we built. And collabs, by the way, stands for collaborative labs, is kind of taking a look at these rows and digitizing each row in a uniform way. So that was the digitization approach that we ended up taking at BMS for laboratory data.
That sounds a great initiative, AJ. How did you find, in a way, a similar question to ask before, how was the change management, not just perhaps at your scientist level, but how do you engage with the different sort of technology partners to sort of make that happen?
Right. So, change management is always, as other panelists have said, change management is always the big thing, right? I mean, you can put up the best of the digital solution, and if nobody uses it, then it's no good. And in marketing, there is a saying that if the dog doesn't like dog food, then it doesn't matter how good a dog food that you made. So the dog has to like dog food. So change management is both a top-down approach as well as the bottoms-up approach. So one of the things that we did was we said, okay, we are going to take this and do incrementally. So we did it lab by lab. So what we did was we went to first lab and we said, okay, here is the solution, the LIMS solution that we are proposing, which meets all your requirements. And we'll build a library of components or workflows that work with this solution. And then we had one, and that we use that lab to help us champion the solution with the other labs. And now we have, I think, the current count. I no longer manage that group. While I was managing, we implemented it in 10 labs. I think now it is up to probably 15 labs, and we are just one at the time. We are, and when I say lab, it's one functional area. So we are implementing, gradually. We are, the plan is to implement it in all the labs, and it's just going incrementally, one at a time, one lab in 4 to 6 weeks, onboarding a lab, because we can reuse the previous components in the LIMS system or the ELN system, and then add a few more to that. So that's the approach we have taken, and the previous users have all kind of helped us propagate this in the other lab and help manage it. But it also required a lot of top-down, impetus. So the managers have to come and say, hey, look, this is actually going to help us in future. So if you were to use a portfolio management or project management tool as part of this suite, we can do reporting up as to how much time we are spending on each project, or we can manage the workflow, which is a request fulfill requirement to the other group much better, because otherwise we're not capturing the right metadata to help that. And there's a lot of waste of time when people are sending emails back and forth. So that is it is really, on one hand, you're using the top-down approach to look at the management imperatives. On the other hand, you're trying to show the end users how it is going to simplify their lives, if not today, at least tomorrow. Because obviously, just entering data in an Excel spreadsheet is the easiest. But if you were to sell the value proposition in long term, I think that becomes very helpful for the end users as well in long term.
Yeah, no, that sounds a great initiative. And did you find, just back to the sort of shared services, did you find that certain things were easier to make common across the labs than others in terms of, was it more the requesting parts that and the sample management that you were able to more easily consolidate?
No, I think we were able to actually consolidate across many of the verticals. So, for example, for the planning and workflow, we built a workflow management tool based on, we call it Tempo, based on BonitaSoft. For the lab management and LIMS, we ended up using Sapio. The most challenging part, and for raw file management, we ended up using iRods, which is an open source platform and sits on S3 buckets. The most challenging part, of course, is ELNs, and ELNs are, very hard to kind of get out of or implement new ones and all that, because it is, ELN, for anyone who has ever managed ELN, you know that ELN is probably the most challenging space.
Okay.
And the things we most of the time have more than one ELN at the same time in place. So there's like several ELNs across the entire organization. We can also copy what you said on requesting, and we have a similar discussion. So if basically in your project you decide to run an activity on a certain compound, you would still need to go to request basically, at example, the assay in the requesting system for assays. You have to request on the material in your compound logistics. You have to request eventually cells in a different system because it's a cell-based assay. In the end, it all has to come together then at the assay owner who has to run then the assay. And that's also one example of basically where we have need for integration to make that easier for our customers, that they go to one place, do the request, and then automatically we trick all the needed basically follow-up actions on that request without them needing to go to different systems and filling in the same data over and over again.
Just to add maybe a question, I really like the approach AJ was describing. I think one of the daunting and challenging tasks in that, no matter how you approach this, is, the solutions are always solutions, right? But what's the underlying data model that we agree upon, and standard identifiers for samples? Maybe AJ, do you share that view? It's that is the actual challenge. It's not the tools themselves and which ELN or which LIMS system particularly, but it's the actual data model, and then how that data model then manifests itself in the commercial tools, or you might need to augment them a bit to make that happen. Just trying to get some feedback from AJ. Was that a challenge from the data perspective?
So data standardization is always a challenge, and we always try to, our ideal is always to have fair data, which is, which is a goalpost, right, that we all try to achieve. And when I talk about data integration a little bit later, I'll talk about one of the other programs that we did called SAGE. And SAGE, we have started the work. We started the work and finished the work actually in real world data space and clinical space, because that was somewhat easier. When it comes to discovery data, where a lot of exploratory work is going on, it's a lot more challenging. And that is the part that, we are trying that out as a first project, a proof of concept in my new area, which is cell therapy. And maybe I'll let you know in 6 months how well, or 3 months actually now, how well it went, because that part is always challenging. I mean, you have to have a lot of agreements between various groups, and there's also a question as to how persistent that data is going to be anyway, and what is the so a lot of effort goes into harmonizing the data, normalizing the data, streamlining all of that, and then if data is never going to be used again, then do we really want to, how much effort and resources you want to put into it? Our goal is to really to have that standardization. I just I'll have to wait for a real experimental result to come out before I can say that we have been successful in that area.
Yeah, we're taking some really baby steps, let's call them like that, with regards to the instrument data. So
yeah.
There are some industry standards out there. We're trying to hook up all of our instruments to that sort of tooling and standards, but that's a real challenge.
Right.
The instrument typically outlives any operating system. They're there for 10, 15 years, if not longer. So how do you ensure that you have that connectivity in the first place? And then it's about, well, what kind of often vendor-driven standards these instruments in file formats they produce. How can we liberate that a bit? So we're as I said, we're making baby steps, and we're doing some pilots in that space from an instrument data perspective to store this data in an industry neutral format, if you wish.
And then with metadata.
One effort that was done. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Thomas. Go ahead.
No, it's all good. But it's also just saying basically we have the same discussions, and basically what I think is most important is that to enrich that raw data also with metadata, so basically can bring it into context and get more information captured with it. So that example for AI, ML later on, you can make sense out of the data.
Yeah. So one of the other groups at BMS implemented an innovation project which has got a lot of traction now, and it's getting into production in various labs. Is this instrument reservation system that they call GRAB, and it's really unique in some ways because when you reserve an instrument, a common instrument or even an instrument in your lab or whatever, it captures a lot of standard metadata to go with it. So you're actually capturing the experimental metadata when you reserve the instrument, and then you can imagine that once you have that data, you can then put it in your ELN or LIMS or wherever you can just at the back end. So now you're capturing a lot of common standard metadata. So if you combine that with, as Thomas was saying, how are you managing your raw data files? In our case, we are using IROBs for managing technical metadata. So you can sort of envision this ecosystem, which starts with reservation of instruments, to capturing the results, to capturing the raw files, and then eventually capturing the analysis, and that becomes your complete lab ecosystem in some ways. And you have to add other areas such as project project integration and things like that. So.
Sorry, since we're all, sounds great. Since we're all on the lab space, given that 2020 is going to be known for COVID-19, what are the challenges that you faced in sort of, balancing, the time that scientists are available and can come on site? Because in the UK, at least, we've gone into a second lockdown this week. How has technology perhaps helped with some of the COVID issues that you faced in your company? I know, AJ, you had some, and I think Robin, you'd had some things that you've been able to do.
So in our case, we have a simple system that different sites are using different different systems just based on local needs. But in Seattle, we have a system that we partnered with one of the smaller biotechs in Boston area, just a informal partnership, and they developed a tool called Swift, and all it really does is basically how people sign up for a lab, and they say what kind of experiments they're doing and how many and who are they going to be with in the lab. So we kind of, and then at the back end it has certain standardization, but the front end is Tableau kind of presentation of what is going on. So you can see how many people are in a lab on a given day, with how many other people and who have they come in contact with. So it has contact tracing, it has actual capacity management, it has some of the prioritization built in as to, which, so the management can say, okay, well, 3 people have requested to be on the lab at the same day, but these 2 experiments are more important, so we're going to allow only 2 of them, and then we're going to manage them in morning, afternoon shifts. So those are the kinds of things that this really simple tool, which takes the data from an Excel and then really integrates it in the back end and provides a Tableau visualization. That's what it provides.
Yeah, it sounds very useful.
Yeah, similar to AJ, we've I guess brought out some tools that help the collaboration in the lab. Be it you are in an office space or you're working from home, how can you connect back into the lab? Remote desktop tools to log into your lab PC to see how your particular experiment is progressing. I mentioned the tablets already, so this has actually helped. We've all suddenly, this is not lab specific. We all moved to Teams as a company. as an added bonus to that, now that the scientists actually had their computer in the labs, they could easily, use Teams to connect to any colleague, really share their screen, or, use their webcam to actually physically show what they're doing. So it's a combination of those tools, I guess. Remote desktop capabilities, tablets in the labs, webcams we've done as well. We do have a booking tool, but again, that's not lab specific to sort of check on capacity. Yeah, and I think one of the, if I try to project forward a bit, as you say, Nick, I think we'll be in this for a bit longer. So I think we need to put more efforts into make the labs less dependent on specific individuals, if that makes sense. And that's not saying it disrespectful, but how do you transfer work to others, basically? If I get sick, how can my colleague pick up where I left? That's a challenge in a lab today, because it's my experiment. Where's that logged actually? Where's my data going? And how do we make that a lot more transparent whilst the experiments progress? So I think that's, projecting forward a bit. I think that's where we need to put more effort into to make the lab less dependent on specific individuals, and then also continue the de-densification. What can we do with collaboration tools and things like that? But it's a real challenge. I mean, we're still onboarding new employees. How do you, it's simple things like, how do you train a new employee in the lab when you're supposed to distance two meters from each other, right? That's a challenge. So, even tools like AR, VR, we've tested a bit on can we use that to train people in the lab? So again, I think there's some of those areas we need to keep progressing with and deploying and testing.
I think basically the including like externals into your project, that has been really a challenge in the beginning, because maybe we're all global areas. We're basically all collaborating with external consultants in our projects. And then basically once you're outside of your company network, you basically actually see which systems are still easily accessible actually from outside, and which systems is really a challenge to get people basically trained on, onboarded on, and getting access to. But overall, it went surprisingly well. In the beginning of long term, we were quickly set up correctly, actually. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think that is probably relevant equally in the healthcare, isn't it? That the change that has been around sort of virtual, virtual doctor appointments has something. If it had perhaps been at normal pace, we wouldn't be having it for 5 years. But the real, the need and the acceleration that COVID has brought has challenged the whole workflow of R&D and all the way through to the patient engagement, which is obviously can be a webinar in its own right. But maybe just take perhaps a change of tack now, given you've given such good summary of around augmenting the scientist in sort of the earlier parts of the data lifecycle. Let's perhaps cover the broader aspects of data and not just the creation of it, but its use downstream and the support that is applied in terms of decision making and decision analysis. I know, AJ, you've done some work, and it's probably one of your specialisms around the role of decision making and the tools there. Did you want to bring up any of the things that you've been looking into in BMS?
Yes, so as I, at the beginning when I mentioned that we, one of our big projects last year and ongoing this year, some parts of it was a project called SAGE, and the SAGE ecosystem is really a fair data platform, and what it does is it brings it has multiple components to it. It's a very large program, multiple components. One of the biggest challenges that you have when you're working, and especially in a translational lab, is that a lot of your work is being done in specialty labs and other labs and then the data comes to you through central labs. Now, these are all clinical trials related data. When the data comes to you for a clinical trial, when the data comes, that data is usually very pristine, very good, very usable, the biomarker data or the other data, right? I think the problem comes that when is with the exploratory data. So with every clinical trial, not only do you have the data that is that you're collecting for clinical trials, but you're also collecting quite a bit of exploratory data, exploratory biomarker data especially. And how do you harmonize? And these come from some of the labs that are very small, very specialized things like that. So how do you bring all of this data together? So data ingestion, and then you may have your own internal labs, which are very specialized. So you're kind of bringing data from all over. How do you bring all the data together coherently? Then you have the other data that is, so then you say that, well, if I have all the data, I want to really manage the data and refine it, but I don't want to put all the resources in managing and refining the data up front. So then you say, okay, can I build something like a data lake or a data common where all the data is coming in, and then I can refine it one step at a time and make it available for to a purpose specific tool, whether it is your data explorer for real world, or whether it's a computational system where you're making data available to bioinformaticians and other people. The third aspect of this is how do you manage the conformed data sets, whether they are for a clinical trial that is closed. So now you have the data sets like ADAM and SDTM data sets, and now trial is closed, but if you can do the cross trial analysis for biomarkers and other things, then you can say, you can actually benefit your other trials, and your clinical trials can benefit from them. And then are there visualization tools that you can put on top of it that would make it easy for self-service for the end users? And so we brought all of these together, and what we did was we built a data lake called Sage Data Lake, just using standard Amazon technologies with microservices. We used some of the tools that come out of Informatica to manage the data lineage and data catalog and business glossary and things like that. And then we said, let's put reproducible research overlay on it. And what we did for that is we used Domino and with R and SAS, but we also built a really nice data explorer to go with it. And then the most important user-facing part of it was actually semantic search. So not only did we bring the data together, but we semantically linked all the data. And there we used components like SciBytes Termite or Cinequad, the backend, to create the knowledge graphs and made it all searchable through a tool called Discover from a company called Ontoforce. And so it gives a really nice user interface for users to look at the data, internal data, whether it's related to drugs and diseases and assays and genes, etc., but also kind of combine the data from our internal sources, whether it's clinical trials or real world, etc., with some of the external sources such as clinicaltrials.gov or PubMed and things like conference abstracts and things like that. So now this becomes an entire ecosystem. By the way, we also put signals from PerkinElmer to visualize biomarker data and things like that. So now it becomes a comprehensive ecosystem for ingesting the data, to aggregating the data, semantically linking the data, and using the data for computational analysis or a simple or a complex visualization.
Yeah, no, that's a great summary of all the steps. I'll hand over to Thomas in a minute to perhaps, because obviously with his AI ML hat, he has an interest in the consumption of that data and obviously the model building. But AJ, in a couple of words, which of the you mentioned what you had done, which of those was the hardest part to do in that project?
Oh, I didn't mention the hardest part. I not even mentioned the hardest part. Obviously the data access, data governance, and the pieces where, and especially if you work in the clinical space, and you can imagine that there are, in any company there are healthy tensions and reasons why the people who are at the in discovery organization or early research organization would want to have access to a lot of data, because all research is now translational research, and they benefit by looking at the data that are but on the other hand, you can end up compromising the clinical trials. So you have to have a healthy balance of what data is available to who, why, and how much, right? So that that is the most challenging part, and there are really no easy answers to that. That has to be top down, and it has to come from someone who's heading the research to someone who's heading the development, and there have to be some organizational agreements in place as to what kind of data you make available when. And that to me is work in progress. I don't think there's any easy answer to that.
Yes, no, that well said. I mean, Thomas, with your hat on, as you said about your interest in or using data for AI ML purposes, in this sort of bringing data together, have there been particular challenges or projects that you've had to try and work on within Roche?
I mean, generally speaking, so everything basically we discussed in the first part of the discussion is only basically possible if you have a good data quality in your company. And I think so basically data is one of our main assets, as we anyhow in the entire value chain actually mainly produce data and consume data to drive the drug discovery process. I think the challenge is that you basically create data in various type of activities, like going from assay development through logistics to actually something like MDO assays. They have a quite strict procedure behind them. And so I think it's mainly a change discussion. So basically we have to convince actually the people producing the data how important it is to curate the data properly, and that the effort, for example, to put that data into our, like, let's say, is linked to our, example, assay registration systems to be able to upload into our data warehouses. We have the structure and semantics in place. Actually pays out in the end because the data becomes actionable later on. If, for example, want to build MLAI models on it to learn it and drive their science actually, or augment them or support them in the decision making. So again, it's a bit of a change topic because it basically needs so many people involved in so many different activities. Recognizing actually the value of spending effort and time into improving the data quality. And you might have already heard, like, we have things like RTS in place with our Roche Terminology service, where basically we have like the option to have like clear semantics in place, linked it to our data, create metadata, link it also to that one. We have with BDS already a quite sophisticated and advanced data warehouse for our assay data and assay results. It's just basically really convincing the scientists that the effort to go through all those validation processes is worth their time.
And I think you've both already mentioned that sort of complete life cycle, and you know, Thomas, you covered that in terms of still having to focus on the data creator. Robin, with the work that you've been doing, you know, with the enhancements to the lab, have you already been able to see an improvement in the data that is then available or accessible within some of your downstream systems, or is that still a little bit too early to see that data coming through?
I would say it's in pockets, yes. So just to hook into the sort of the AI machine learning discussion, completely recognize the things AJ said around, you know, from getting more value from your clinical data and translating that back into the sort of the discovery phase. But even in the discovery phase itself, I think that's what Thomas is alluding to. Even there, with the data producers not seeing necessarily, you know, okay, from a primary analysis perspective, you know, it's you know, it's a nice operating and you know, workflow and well defined, but then you have other, you know, data scientists that want to get access to that data. And, you know, how do you, you know, instruments, you know, they keep on producing new data. How much of that data is actually valuable in the long term? You know, how much of this data are we going to store? How much do we, by company policy, actually need to throw away? And you know, so even in that discovery phase, I think there is work to be done. So one specific example, we have a mass spec center of excellence where we've made some progress in that space, with literally just defining, okay, how as a center of excellence, how are we going to agree to store this data, and for how long are we going to keep this data, and what of this data now needs to go into the lake, as AJ was referring to. We have a similar sort of lake to make that data available for further analysis. So in that area, I think we're making great progress, but that's just one instrument type, if you wish. We have a lot more areas to go at. So I hope that gives some flavor, Nick. It's again, it's small steps.
And I think it speaks to what, or I think all of you have brought up, that you have to start small, or in capabilities that you're able to work with, and have speedy delivery back to them to show the bigger picture. I mean, this is a question I think I saw come in earlier, is when you've been talking to your scientist colleagues about what digitization means, have you been able to get to a consensus, or is it still quite a broad term? I know it's probably overused these days, but do you feel your scientists get that?
I don't ask that question any longer, Nick. It's actually this morning to this point, it's one of the comments. Well, we need to find something else to, let's call it a what if session rather than a digitization, because people are getting a bit annoyed by the word, maybe perhaps. But it's been really a challenge from our perspective. Instantly you get, when you ask that question, the first step is you get all the pain points and all the sort of bugs that are in the systems that we have. And you need to give that time to whatever scientists or groups of scientists to let them breathe out for a while, and capture them and start to order them, and then you can move on to, okay, well, hearing all that, let's have a couple of those what if sessions and paint a more visionary picture of what your world could look like. The word data or digitization absolutely appears in those more what if sessions, but I'm not necessarily going into a lab saying, hey, here I am, I'm here to digitize your lab. That hasn't worked particularly well.
No, that's great insight.
Yeah, I like the what if point. I mean, we basically see the same. It depends with who you talk in which area they are. Actually, they have a different view on digitization, or what digitalization means to them. And I mean, often it's basically just like improving or optimizing something that's already existing. But it should be more about basically coming up with new, more innovative things, basically being more transformative, thinking about what if, and getting a bit out of the box. And so that's less about digitizing things. It's more about being more transformative with what do you do with your data? What are you using it for? Where can you create more value with data you're already having? Or where can you capture new data that you can then also leverage in different use cases? So.
Cool. I mean, we've touched on this a little bit about the challenges that you faced, whether it be the people, the technology, the data, or the change management. Do you feel that that's one of those really stands out in terms of what you've been able to you've had to work on during your projects? Which of those was the most important to solve first, or to get buy-in for across the sort of people, technology, data, process part?
It's a great question, Nick. I think you need all. I think the most challenging one is probably the cultural side. In an early science sort of discovery side, I think our company, and we're by no means, I'm guessing, unique, that data is part of the company strategy. Everybody realizes there's more value to get from the data that we already have, no doubt. But I think that's that culture of me and my data, or me and my instrument, and that's the journey to move away from that. So for me, it's all those pillars that you talked about, but I think the most challenging one is probably the cultural one.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, because we now see basically where you're sitting at the interfaces between different functions areas. So basically you have to have the discussion with like a lot of people with totally different backgrounds, and then basically come to get a conclusion why you think basically it's worthwhile doing something to create value. So it's really important. Like, it's a big communication, common understanding, and change topic.
So I completely agree with both Robin and Thomas. I think one thing I would add is the other thing. A lot of times the people who are generating the data are not the end users of all the data that they are generating, and but when you build a system and you ask a lot of metadata to be captured, it imposes on their time. And I think one aspect of culture change is really to, sell the value proposition of good data collection to people who are probably never going to use that data themselves. It's going to use the people who are, more in terms of who are going to analyze the data, or who are going to do retrospectively or prospectively look at the data, or the processes and how they played out. So I think, but it takes up a lot of time. So for example, we build this, a system to manage the workflows and manage the, and manage the projects, if you will. And the people who were, people who were entering the data, we asked them to enter a lot more data than they were used to. And we said, well, we want to use this data downstream, and we are going to use it a year from now or 2 years. Like, but why am I wasting my time today in capturing all this data? It takes me 10 extra minutes, and I'm doing 5 requests a day. You just took away 45 minutes of my time or 50 minutes of my time in a day. And to get that buy-in, working with their managers and working with them and explaining the value proposition that enterprise overall has, to me, that is a challenge. And I think it's part of the culture of how do we become a data centric company. If you were to become a data centric company, then collecting this data is important. Even though I, as a data producer, may not see the value, the enterprise sees the value of that data.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, and we've got a couple of minutes left, so I'll sort of perhaps in a minute ask each of you what would be your vision for the next 12 months in terms of perhaps what you see happening in this area. But I think, just to trying to quickly recap, in what AJ's just said, that it's about empowering both the data creator to see the value of their role, but equally enabling that data lifecycle, that data pipeline, all the way through to the groups that are doing that secondary, tertiary, and analysis over multiple years. And that the change management, I think, as you've all said, it is really, perhaps the primary aspect, but it's also the way that you go about your change management in picking, small projects, viable projects up front, and seeking to get buy-in through early success and value back to the scientists. For instance, with stuff you brought up, Robin, with your support for the lab scientist in terms of moving about and bringing things out and from the lab equipment. But as I say, just to perhaps, we've got a couple of minutes, just wanted to pick your brains on what you see. Do you see any different challenges ahead over the next 12 months, or is it more of the same but trying to scale out to new groups? Was there anything you'd like to bring up? We can perhaps go around the table and cover that in the last couple of minutes. I mean, Thomas, do you have any quick thoughts on that?
I mean, it's basically taking all what we discussed now in the discussion. Basically, is the ideas, the strategy that's out there, and now basically it's about actually implementing it. So I think we basically triggered a lot of initiatives and programs and projects internally in Roche. We did quite some business analysis and strategic discussion around what we want to do, and then now it's basically about going ahead and then starting really implementing those ideas.
Cool, thanks. AJ, anything to add?
No, I think we are continuing on the path in a different area, and working in 3 categories. I mean, harmonize the data within each system, harmonize the data across the systems, and harmonize the data and make it available by linking it semantically across BMS and with the external data. And that challenge is enormous. And I think some problems hopefully we'll solve this year, like data governance. But at least we'll make progress in it. But I think this is overall a daunting task, and you have to start the journey somewhere, but it's a long journey.
Yes, and Robin?
No, it's mostly scaling out or scaling up what we were already doing. I think the one point maybe I'd like to add is a more context-aware lab for the scientist's sake. The experience in the lab. I might walk into the lab and the information comes to me. The system knows who I am already. That sort of augment further the experience in the lab is, I think, an area we need to look at more.
Yeah, I think that's a great point in terms of usability. You know, it can be a webinar in its own right, and particularly, you know, everyone's time is precious, and making the most of that time, you know, both outside work and inside work is going to be critical. But in the interest of time, and we've had a great hour of discussion, I absolutely want to thank all three of you for both the time you've spent today in and all the preparation that you've helped put into this. I'd like to thank all those that have asked questions today. As we said, I think Zifo will share the recording of this afterwards, and happy, I think they're keen to get ideas for future webinars, and it's been a pleasure on my behalf to moderate it. And I'd like to thank again Thomas, Robin, and AJ for all your efforts and great comments today. And I wish everyone hopefully a calm rest of the year and hopefully a good rest of the week. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you. Bye-bye.